Thank you all for coming out this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Miss Maddy Heredia. She is a partner with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife, she's a Partners for Fish and Wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service based here in Frankfort, Kentucky, and that's with the Kentucky Ecological Services Field Office. Through the Partners Program, she works to conserve and recover Kentucky's most vulnerable species by collaborating with landowners and other key partners to apply beneficial management practices across the Commonwealth. If everyone would help me introduce Miss Maddy Heredia this morning. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My position title is a mouthful. I am a Partners for Fish and Wildlife biologist with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so you did great. But anyway, I'm here to talk to you today specifically about conservation connections. We had a lot of great presentations this morning about some research and some management and specifics on how you can replicate that on your properties. But I'm going to do a little bit more broad about just the power of partnerships and connections and collaboration, which I believe to be the key to success in conservation. So I'll first introduce our agency for those who don't know us. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we do a lot of things on a national level, but I'm going to shrink it back down into the state level. Essentially, we are tasked with carrying out kind of the Endangered Species Act. Specifically, ecological services. We are the listing authority for species listed under the Endangered Species Act. We also do regulatory compliance regarding these species when involving federal agencies and federal funding, so that the federal government avoids harming any of these species. And lastly, we compile and contribute to research and create recovery plans for these species. So currently in Kentucky, we have 52 listed species as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And in addition to that, there are hundreds of more at-risk species and species of greatest conservation need that we work really closely with our partners to help monitor the statuses of those, because we're not just concerned with the listed species, we're concerned of all species that have potential to become listed. So our goal with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is to influence conservation to aid in the downlisting of these species or recovery of these species. And as most of us know in this room, over 90% of Kentucky's natural areas where these species exist, where their habitat is, where their remnant habitat is privately owned. And so historically, to do the on-the-ground management that these species need for the habitat that they depend on, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was limited to working on our own federally owned lands, and in Kentucky that limits us to 2 refuges. So the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program was created in 1987 as a mechanism for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to work with private landowners to reach shared objectives and work towards recovery of our most vulnerable species. We provide financial and or technical assistance to landowners who have supporting habitat for federal trust species and are voluntarily willing to do management on their property to benefit them. And I want to stress that this is a completely voluntary program. You having these species or this habitat on your property does not obligate you to work with us to help benefit for them. Everyone, big bad government, but we're not. So today, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, or you'll hear me say PFW throughout this presentation, is chartered by the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Act. And there are several objectives that we have to further our mission that I displayed on the previous slide. And those are to promote and implement habitat improvement projects to benefit federal trust species, provide conservation leadership and promote conservation practices, encourage public understanding and participation, and work with USDA to implement mutually beneficial conservation work. That's a very specific goal, and the other ones seem to be a little bit more broad. But the USDA's NRCS conservation programs through the Farm Bill is one of the largest funding sources for conservation on privately owned lands. So they have a lot of money. We, as many of you in this room, want to help them spend it towards our conservation goals. So the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program was designed to kind of work in tandem with NRCS to further our mission of focusing on aiding recovery for our imperiled species. So the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program is not a typical grant or an application process program. Programs or projects are funded at the discretion of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partners biologists, which is myself and one other person. And so the only limitations that we really have is that we can't work on state or federally owned lands. The projects kind of have to benefit a federal trust species, the ones that I mentioned earlier. We have no acreage minimum. We're able to work on both aquatic habitat and terrestrial habitat. And the only teeth really in an agreement that we have with the landowner is that they have to agree to leave the practice for 10 years and not reverse it. If they do, then the landowner is responsible for reimbursing us for our expenses. So here's a map that shows where we work in the state. I wanted to throw a fun fact out there, just kind of on a national scale too, but the Partners program started in the late 80s, and it has since worked with roughly 50,000 landowners to complete over 65,000 landowner agreements, or what we call projects, on 6 million acres nationwide. So each state has a Partners program, and each state also has a strategic plan associated with that program, and this one is ours. This map's a little misleading. It shows that we have 2 partners biologists, and then we have like designated areas in the state that we work in. That's not true. We're all over the place. But we do have focal areas, and so our focal areas in Kentucky, these are driven by the listed species, the habitat, and where there's the most overlapping goals for conservation, or where our priorities are at the time. And so we have 4 in Kentucky, being the Central Barrens area, the Green River, Stream, and Karst area, the Licking River area, and the Buck Creek area, or watershed. And so I also want to mention that we are not restricted to working within these areas. These are just our priority areas, but we can work outside these areas, and we do it all the time. So before I jump to the next section, I'm going to pull a Jody and ask everyone to raise their hand. And I want to see a show of hands if you have sufficient resources, financial or other, to carry out all your objectives on the ground to meet your conservation goals. Yeah, me neither. So I think that's where the importance of collaboration and collaborative conservation steps in. And so the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program defines collaborative conservation as working with private landowners, state agencies, non-governmental organizations, and others to achieve collective impacts. Through the power of partnerships, we are able to tackle more complex problems, avoid duplicating efforts, achieve multiple or common goals, and by the last show of hands on that poll resources, which is a super important objective of ours. And in fact, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife funding is designed to leverage buy-in and support from other groups towards common goals. It's not necessarily enough money to cover all the projects all over the state to benefit all these species that we want to help. So I'm going to walk you through in the next couple slides 2 examples of some projects that we've completed over the last few years that really highlight the power of our partnerships and working together. So the first project is called the Kentucky Gladecrest and Monarch Butterfly Habitat Project. This project is in our Central Barrens focal area. And the Barrens community in general, there's less than 1% of this habitat remaining in Kentucky. And to be more specific, the Dolomite Barren Glades, where the Kentucky Gladecrest exists, is considered globally and critically imperiled by nature preserve. So on this project, we had like 9 different partners. I think I'm counting that right. We had the Future Fund Land Trust, ourselves, KDFWR, NRCS, Kentucky Division of Forestry, the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, RES, or Resource Environmental Solutions, and Louisville Metro Parks. This project was in total about 25 acres, and the species that we really focused on benefiting and creating habitat were for the Kentucky Gladecrest, which is federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act, the monarch butterfly. It's not currently listed, but it is a candidate species, and it's a national priority just because of its significant declines. The Indiana bat, and then this project also helped create habitat for the Henslow sparrow, which is not a federally listed species, but it is a species of greatest conservation need. So the focus, while all these species benefited and several more that are not listed, the focus of this project was the Kentucky Gladecrest. And so the Kentucky Gladecrest is a small winter annual plant in the mustard family, known to occur in only 2 counties in Kentucky, being Bullitt and Jefferson. It occurs in dolomite or limestone glades, which are, you can kind of see in this photo, these open, shallow soils, very like low competition because not much else can grow there areas. And then there's another photo down here that shows a little bit more barren activity, but you can see, I can't see on that screen, but you can see there we go. Some of these little pockets with the exposed bedrock are the glades. It germinates in the fall and blooms in late winter or early spring, and it's a poor competitor, which is very specific why it prefers that habitat. And it's also presumed to have very low genetic diversity, which doesn't have that going for it, so that makes our job a little bit harder. Its largest known threats are habitat loss through agricultural and commercial development, and the loss of routine disturbance or fire, resulting in forest encroachment on the remaining habitat. So the Kentucky Gladecrest, it's listed as it's listed on the Endangered Species Act, but it also has listed designated critical habitat. And for those who don't know, these are specific geographic areas that are essential to a species conservation listed under the ESA. Not all species under the ESA have designated critical habitat. It just depends on the amount of data that we have to support those geographic areas. And so this project occurred almost on, but very, very near to designated critical habitat. This is the project outline. You can see that there's a dolomite shelf that goes from this little finger down here and then into this like remnant barrens area. You can kind of see that open spot that curves, and there's like some right here. I know they told me not to turn my head. I can't help it. There's some little rocky patches that you can see in this area. So this project, the landowner and the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves brought this project to us in 2019. And Nature Preserves has been involved in this project since the very beginning, helping Future Fund Land Trust to acquire and protect this land through the Kentucky Heritage Land Conservation Fund. For those who aren't familiar, the Future Fund Land Trust, they work in the Louisville metro area, just outside of it, and they work to acquire land and protect it along the Floyd's Fork corridor. So our first thing that we did was we did some surveys, and biologists found several locations suitable for Kentucky Gladecrest reintroduction. And then ourselves we worked very closely with Nature Preserves on steps moving forward for reintroduction. We also found more suitable habitat for native barren restoration, kind of around that glade area that I showed earlier, and that totaled to about 21 acres. So ultimately, we worked with the landowner and we kind of came up with two overarching goals for this project, and that was for the glade crest reintroduction and for barren habitat restoration. And so in the next couple of slides, I'm gonna try not to give you whiplash, so bear with me, but I'm gonna flip-flop between the progression of both of those goals based on the timeline that we applied our management practices. So the first thing we did is we reached out to our friends at KDFWR to assist the landowner in applying for EQIP, or the Environmental Quality Incentive Program through NRCS, to receive cost share for the barren habitat restoration practices. The Partners for Fish and Wildlife program funded the herbicide that was necessary to do some initial invasive species removal around the glade crest reintroduction site. And then the landowner contributed like in-kind match and labor through equipment that they had, and then some community neighbors came out to help operate that equipment. In May of 2023, the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves scattered Kentucky glade crest seed that they collected under compliance from nearby populations into the prep sites. Nature Preserves also completed a follow-up survey in March of 2024 to see if there was any success from the initial planting, and there was. Unfortunately, you can see in location 1 and location 2, we had 0 flowering plants, and that was because we had some sediment washout from a bank just above the glades, which was pretty unfortunate. But we have since taken care of that and tried to stabilize that bank and kind of let it rest. We didn't put any more glade crest seeds in those specific sites on the second planting. Back to the barren restoration, our EQIP application was accepted and site prep began on the 21 acres that included some initial herbicide applications. Again, herbicide was provided by the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, and the landowner applied the practices. We also have a cooperative agreement with the Kentucky Division of Forestry to help with prescribed fire capacity on our end. And we are so grateful for that and our partners there. And we conducted a prescribed fire alongside the herbicide applications, both in spring of 2023 and 2024. And then we had a final burn down or brown down right before planting that last herbicide application. Again, we provided the herbicide and the landowner did the work. In late April 2024, RES reached out to the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves and ourselves regarding a site that had Kentucky glade crests in it. This is a different site completely, with a population that would be harmed from planned development. And so after ensuring compliance with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Nature Preserves threw together kind of like a last-minute salvage day to go out to this site in the pouring rain, and it was pretty fun, and collect all the viable seed from those plants that were going to get destroyed. We were able to collect 2,000 seeds from this local population, and that is a very large number for Kentucky glade crests. Normally when you're harvesting under compliance, like sustainably, you can only take a couple seeds from each plant just to make sure that you're not going to deplete the population. So that was just a large number. So I want a huge thanks to Nature Preserves for throwing this together and just for their rare plant monitoring program and ongoing efforts to monitor and recover this species. I mentioned seeds were in abundance this year due to the ability to collect all the seed from the population. So we were able to plant over 1,000 seeds, which I think in the last slide that I had, the chart, there was only like a couple hundred that we planted in that initial planting. So we were able to plant over 1,000 in the previous reintroduction sites and some new ones this year. The erosion issues were addressed, and it will be visited again in March, April of 2025 to monitor the success. And then back to the barren restoration, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program worked with Roundstone Native Seed and nature preserves to customize a highly diverse native forbs and grassland mix for this site. And we put a heavier amount of native milkweed to benefit monarch reproduction. The planting was a huge group effort involving several partners, including KDFWR. Huge thanks to Cody and Brandon for letting us borrow their seed drill and also calibrating it, because I think we would still be out there trying to calibrate it if it wasn't for them. So thank you guys. The neighboring landowners came out to help and provided their heavy equipment. We had volunteers from EKU come out for the day. And of course, we were there as the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. There was a delay in the final burn down spraying, so we weren't able to plant until June. Ideally, we would have liked to do that a little bit earlier. We had some very dry weather after that, and so we might have had a little bit more success if we had been able to do it a little earlier. Oh, I want to go back. I also forgot to mention, I am also traumatized by Johnson grass, because shortly after that planting, a couple weeks later, we had like a half an acre like pop up where the prescribed fire was like the hottest, and I think it just like stimulated that. It was a nightmare. So yes, I am also personally victimized by Johnson grass. We went out there and took care of that. But like the previous speaker mentioned, you're not going to know the success of these plantings the very first growing season. So we're excited to get back out there, see what it looks like, hopefully less Johnson grass, and then also see what happens with the Kentucky glade cress and see how they thrived or did not on this second planting. So in summary, this project took over 7 years. There's just a lot of moving parts and partners involved. We planted 21 acres of native forb and grasslands for a barren restoration that supported the monarch butterfly reproduction and nectaring habitat. It provided habitat for other pollinator species, grassland burns, and foraging habitat for Indiana bats that use the Floyd's Fork corridor. And then we also established Kentucky glade cress on about 5 acres of suitable habitat. And so there are several partners that I mentioned that are in this room right now, and I just want to give a huge thanks to them, because we are nothing without our partners. And we're just very grateful for the relationships that we have. The second project I'm going to take you through is more of an aquatic focused one. And if you have follow-up questions on this, I'll do the best that I can, but this is a project that occurred before my time here. And I won't go in depth on this one, but this project occurs in our Roundstone Creek, or the Buck Creek focal area of the Partners for Fish and Wildlife strategic plan. And this is kind of a hotspot for some native fish, but especially a lot of our federally listed mussels. So this is the Roundstone Creek Barrier Removal Project, and this was a collaborative project between ourselves, KDFWR's Center for Mollusk Conservation, and NRCS, Kentucky Division of Water, and the Division of Transportation. So Roundstone Creek, just to give you a little bit of the significance of this site, is a major tributary of the Rockcastle River, and it's a strategic focus area for us due to its biodiversity. Roundstone Creek is designated as a focused conservation area by NRCS, and it's also considered an outstanding resource that's recognized by other groups like the Division of Water and the Nature Conservancy. This project was specifically focusing on the federally endangered Cumberland bean, and then the striped darter, which is not listed. It's considered a stable species in our state, but it's very important to the life cycle of the Cumberland bean because it's its host fish. So the Cumberland bean is known from the Cumberland and Tennessee river systems, but today it's mostly known from the Rockcastle River and its tributaries. It's a very small mussel, usually found in shallow riffle and shoal areas, frequently found in the transition zones of like gravel to sand. And so because mussels are pretty sedentary, they are especially vulnerable to stream disturbances, historical impoundments being kind of one of the major issues for mussels right now. Any kind of barriers that are installed for flood control, navigation, hydroelectric power production, and recreation have caused severe population decline in a lot of our mussel species. Another threat to this species is siltation. Comes from strip mining, coal washing, dredging, farming, logging, and other road construction. And there are other threats as well. You can see this is a kind of a distribution map of where they occur in Kentucky as well. I want to give a little bit of an overview of mussels, like life cycles, and why this connectivity of streams is so important. Mussels don't move. I like to joke that they're like just live rocks, but they're very important to our biological like functions. And but anyhow, for those who don't know, mussels have these appendages that are they're called a foot that kind of help them dig down into the substrate. And you'll have a male mussel disperse its sperm into the stream, and then a female will kind of catch it downstream. And then a lot of mussels have this other kind of appendage that you can see sticking out the top that mimics a prey fish species. And so they're pretty unique. Some mimic crawfish, some mimic darters, some mimic, all different species depending on what the host fish is for this mussels. The host fish will then come close to the mussel thinking it's about to get a yummy snack, and the female mussel will spray its glaucidia or its mussel larva onto her gills, and they'll get stuck and they'll attach on, stay on the female for a little bit, grow, travel with the female, and then when they're old enough, the juvenile mussels drop into the substrate and then bury down and then start that whole thing again. So this is just to show for people who are not familiar with mussel species how crucial connectivity of our streams are, because they rely on other species for their distribution. And one thing that I didn't mention earlier is this creek that we were working in, Roundstone Creek, is one of the best populations of the host fish for this species. And so the host fish is there. There's definitely a lot more research to go into why they are not there anymore. They were able to find relic, I think that's on the next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself, never mind. Anyway, the first site was visited by Partners for Fish and Wildlife biologists. The first site visit occurred in 2022, but discussions about this site in particular with the landowner were ongoing for years beforehand. Previous surveys in this stream conducted by KDFWR, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and nature preserves yielded relic populations of the Cumberland bean, and it's probably a historic population that was extirpated about 30 years ago. In fact, through other surveys, there are about 20 other species that appear to be extirpated from this stream in the Roundstone, like Rockcastle River watershed, due to coal mining, invasive species, and disease. And then again, this is what I mentioned a little too early, but the striped darter is the host fish, and it's endemic to the Rockcastle River system. And through consultation with other aquatic biologists, we found out that it's probably the best population in the world of striped darters. So again, host fish is there. Mussels are not anymore. There's a lot of issues with probably, water quality and some other stuff that we have to do some research in. But connectivity is an issue. And so if we can remove barriers, we're going to try. So this project was a barrier removal for to allow the Cumberland bean and populations to establish further upstream. And then also right where the barrier was, there was a head cut that was like about 100 feet into the landowner's farm that he was about to like lose that field. So we were able to repair that as well. So we worked with the landowner to come up with two goals, being the barrier removal and then repairing the head cut for this project. Repairing the head cut also would help with the siltation that's contributing to the stream as well. So this is what the barrier looked like. It was first thought to be like an old mill dam, which we were like, oh no, it's a historic thing. We're not going to be able to take it out. But NRCS completed the archaeological review, and it turned out to just be an old bridge or passage over the creek that was not in use anymore. And we were able to proceed. It was impeding flow and causing further bank erosion, and the landowner agreed to have it removed. Several partners were involved prior to beginning the project. There's a lot of funding and permitting and stuff working with waterways and dam removal. So that took quite a bit of time, but we are so grateful to NRCS for doing the engineering of the project, as well as I mentioned, they did the archaeological review. They also received the correct compliance from the National Historic Preservation Act, or Section 106. And then the Kentucky Division of Water was involved with the water permitting to consult for water quality, and then they worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to get that permitting under Section 404. Once we were in compliance, that alone itself took about 9 months. So if anyone's trying to like replicate this, I salute you, but just be realistic on the timeline. It could be sooner, depending on how diligent you are. But we were really grateful that we relied on a lot of partners to kind of help us through that permitting. And so 9 months was about how long that took. But once we were in compliance and had all the proper permitting approved, we were able to break ground. We worked with dam removal contractors who specifically specialize in aquatic systems, so that was really nice. And then the Division of Transportation was involved, and they brought trucks out to remove the man-made debris and have it hauled off, so we were very, very thankful for them for that. The bank was levied out into a less steep gradient. Geotextile and rock were laid to stabilize the bank, and then we also did a revegetation where there was a little bit of disturbance above the head cut. The construction itself took 1 day, so day and night. It's kind of crazy. So this is what this looks like after this stream with the barrier and then post barrier, and then this large photo on the left is reared Cumberland beans by the Center for Mullet Conservation. And they are planning on doing under the proper permits and compliance, a reintroduction into this stream. And our hope is by reintroducing the mussels over time and allowing the host fish to move further upstream in the watershed, that the species populations will improve in the Rockcastle River system. There are other projects in progress, conducting more research on the mussel and the success of it, and the decline in the stream to ensure the reproductive success of the reintroduced species. It's kind of fun. I don't know if you guys have ever been involved on a mussel reintroduction, but it's like, I feel like you're planting seeds. Like you're in a wetsuit with a snorkel and a mask, and you get little mussels and you just put them in the substrate. It feels like you're planting them. In summary, this project took in total about 2 years. The compliance and the permitting is a big part of the process, but it's doable. You could do it. We had about 5 partners. We accomplished stream bank stabilization and siltation reduction. We eliminated flow impediments, improved fish migration, and increased ability for mussels to establish further upstream. Huge thanks to these partners as well. I did not talk about anything like new or groundbreaking as far as practices in my presentation today, but I just hope that this served as a reminder of the importance of working together and looking for common ground, and especially in the importance of events like these today, where we're here to learn about some awesome management practices, but also like network. We might not have the same conservation goals, but we might be able to overlap on things and pool our resources together to meet both of our objectives. And so with that, I'll leave you with my contact information. Brent Harrell is the other Partners for Fish and Wildlife biologist in the state, and he's also the state coordinator. So with that, I'll take questions if you have them, but thanks for listening to me.
Got some question back here? I'm coming. Yeah, I was just wondering if Fish and Wildlife or any of the other partners that you have, like, reevaluate who you use for, like, plant material and holding on to propagules. Like, I've heard you might use, like, Cincinnati Zoo for, like, if you get plant material from these, like, seeds of these critically, imperiled species, but you need a partner who has, like, the environmentally controlled capabilities to propagate them, like who you might use.
It depends. We work really closely with our state partners through Section 7. So the Kentucky Nature Preserves is really involved with that specific word of the propagation. We kind of set that up and fund it and work with them. But it depends. I know that there's some seed at Louisville Zoo, and then they're also working with some other small nurseries. But it just depends on the species. We want to replicate the conditions that are like local conditions, so that geographic area goes into play, and then also just the characteristics of the species. If it's an annual, we're not going to try to propagate it and stuff like that. And some of these are really, really hard to propagate. There's, with orchids, they have very specific symbiotic relationships with like mycorrhizae and like fungal stuff in the soil, and it's just so hard to get that right and for propagation and reintroduction. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it really just depends on the species and what we're looking for, on who we work with for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I guess if I was looking to possibly have my botanical garden be a part of that, like, I don't know if I just reach out and be like, if y'all took a site tour and looked at our, you know, environmental controls, our glass houses and greenhouses, and I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I think it'd be a cool endeavor. And I know, like, we're in Crestwood, so I understand, yeah, that would only involve, like, ex situ stuff like that, unless we had the exact environmental conditions of the plants in concern.
Yeah, we can definitely have a discussion about it. I think the most important thing though is to go like logically. If there's something's endangered or threatened, it's like the logical thing to do is like, let's make more of it and put it there. But there's so much that goes into like the local ecotypes and the genetics and stuff like that. So as long as you're working through us or Kentucky Nature Preserves, especially like through the proper channels and under compliance, it's kind of the best way to do it. But yeah, we can just have conversations about it. It's good to know you're interested in case anything pops up.
Up here.
Do you have a place where landowners can submit, I have this idea, that you would then evaluate if it's a good idea for a conservation project?
So for the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program to receive like our funding, like our financial assistance, we do not. We do not have like I said, it's not a traditional application system. The projects that we're funding are very, 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 very specific based on the species there. If you think you have something that's of interest to us based on our federally listed species, talk to me, Regardless, I do want to say we're very picky about our projects, but we are always here to provide technical assistance as well. So if we can't provide financial assistance, like, don't be hesitant to reach out to me. We are always here to serve and provide technical assistance. So yeah.
Thank you. With the Kentucky Glade cress, you collected seeds. Mm-hmm. Did you try to transplant any of the plants?
No. It's an annual plant, so it wouldn't be successful. But yeah, the seeds did yield success in that first year. So hopefully the next year too. There's one over there.
To get over here.
Hi. So I'm just kind of curious, forgive me on the program name, but I know there's a new program for homeowners for bringing in new native plants into an unestablished area to reestablish native plants. Is your program requirement that there already is an established plant, or are you working with that program to go ahead and say, well, we have this property, we want to renative? Does that make sense?
Both.
Thank you.
So yeah, we're working with on properties based on our data and based on where the federal trust species are, or our most imperiled species. We might work on a property that doesn't have the the species that we're working to help recover and keep from going endangered. But we're not just willy-nilly putting things places. We're looking at what was historically there. Does it have the right conditions? Does it have suitable habitat? So yeah, we do often reintroduce things in a very scientific way where there's suitable habitat and where historically we have records of it being, and it's just not there anymore, it's extirpated. But then we also have projects where the plant or the species, the animal, the mussel, whatever is there, and we see that there's visible threats, and we're trying to mitigate that or improve its habitat. So both.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank
Maddy.
you all so much.